more than a year into the US and Israel's unflinching and ongoing televised genocide in Gaza and now Lebanon.
If you are being dishonest intentionally, you are helping the Israeli regime continue its genocide by justifying it through dishonesty. So that's up to you.
When you were in the United States last week, did you not publicly condemn the United States in front of the world for giving the weapons to Israel to commit these genocidal atrocities?
Since October 7th, somebody probably told you that there is a genocide taking place in Gaza. I can understand why Israelis appear to be the bad guys. Hamas has created a very powerful narrative, and the sight of a modern national army entering a city automatically triggers sympathy for them. But what is Hamas exactly? It's an Islamic extremist movement that has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United Nations and the USA 20 years ago. Do you feel comfortable supporting their cause based on the narrative that they have created for you? If you want to hear the other side of the story, keep watching. The war started when Hamas crossed the border into Israeli towns, killed nearly 1,200 people, and kidnapped 251.
احنا لا نريد ان نمس لا بالمدنيين ولا ان نلحق الاذى بهم، لكن اوقات لانه في تعقيدات في الميدان صارت في منطقه موجوده وكان هناك في احتفال وكان في سكان وفي منطقه واسعه ليست سهله.
No, I get it. You see young girls dressed in their party clothes and you think they're just Israeli commandos hiding. And then you go and you see the families in their houses and you think they're armed Israeli soldiers. Happens all the time. After October 7th, the Israeli army entered Gaza to destroy the military capabilities of Hamas and bring back the Israeli hostages. It is estimated that between 40 and 50,000 civilians were killed in the war so far. I regret all unnecessary deaths, but Israel has the right to defend itself. In fact, I don't think Hamas left Israel with any other option but to go to war in Gaza. Any other country would have done exactly the same, if not worse. The moment Hamas started a war was the moment they took responsibility for the safety of their civilians. If you start a war and then civilians die unintentionally, then it's a war, not a genocide. I will just let Douglas say it with his fabulous British accent.
And there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it.
Maybe some of you look at me and see a genocidal maniac with pretty eyes just trying to justify his murderous intents. Let's look at another example. Remember ISIS, the crazy Islamists who want to decapitate anyone who disagrees with them? It is estimated that between 8,000 and 13,000 civilians were killed in the operations against ISIS. Does anybody look at this and think that this is a genocide? Of course not. Nobody in their right mind would support this organization, even if the consequences of war against them are terrible. The war in Gaza is the same. Israel is fighting to re-establish peace for its citizens and destroy a terrorist organization that wants to kill as many Jews as possible. Having more casualties does not mean you're on the right side of history. Unless, of course, you think that the British should not have fought against the Germans in World War II. But still, Israel does plenty to minimize civilian casualties in Gaza. Let's start with some basic facts. Israel has hundreds of aircrafts and thousands of tanks, while Hamas has 0. If Israel actually wanted to commit genocide in Gaza, it would have been wiped out of existence a long time ago. So Israel is obviously restricting its use of force. Israel also warns civilians to leave an area before it becomes a war zone, while Hamas does everything in its power to prevent the evacuation of their own civilians.
Some civilians are heading south from Gaza City, already suffering a humanitarian disaster. They're on the move after the Israeli army gave 1.1 million people 24 hours to flee their homes.
Did you ever hear of a resistance fighter who warned civilians to leave an area before he's Allahu Akbaring all over the place? Kind of defeats the purpose of killing civilians, doesn't it? If you say all that to some pro-Hamas activists, they will probably tell you that nothing can be done to prevent the genocide in Gaza. Really? There is nothing they can do? What did the Japanese do when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II? They stopped the war by surrendering. Yes, it is possible to stop a war even if you're the one who started it. If Hamas surrenders and gives back the hostages, Israel gets what it wants and all the unnecessary death stops immediately. Now we have to ask ourselves, if the so-called genocide is so horrible, why doesn't Hamas just stop it? Maybe they just don't really care about the people of Gaza, or maybe they have a different goal in mind. Maybe it's both. Let's see what they have to say about it.
على أرضنا إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية يجب أن تنتهي لذلك إحنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوة إنه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مرة ثانية وثالثة ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة لأنه إحنا لدينا إصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا إمكانيات أن نقاتل نعم. ونحارب لكن كما قلت لك بدنا ندفع ثمن نعم إحنا مستعدين معلش بدي أقول لك بشكل واضح إحنا اسمنا شعب الشهداء وبنفخر أن نقدم.
So now we know Hamas is not even trying to prevent any casualties. In fact, they are willing to sacrifice as many people as needed to commit more attacks like October 7th until Israel is destroyed. Which is... what's the word I'm looking for? But why did they do all this? What made Hamas decide they need to initiate a war? To understand this, we need to go back to the Abraham Accords. Israel signed an agreement with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain on September 2020. One of the essential elements of this agreement was the recognition of Israel's sovereignty by the Arab side of the agreement in exchange for diplomatic and economic cooperation. If you're not a member of a Jew-hating terrorist organization, you probably look at this as some sort of step towards peace. On the other hand, Hamas is now watching its worst nightmare unfold. What if other Arab countries acknowledge Israel, maybe leading to peace agreements? Then they can destroy Israel and claim to be the good guys, right? The timing of the war was not random. Hamas knows it has to do something to reverse this process. But what exactly can they do? And why did they start a war against an army they know they cannot defeat? Hamas never planned to win in a traditional sense. Instead, they started this war to apply a long-term strategy of delegitimization. They hope this will force the United States, along with other Western countries, to cut their ties with Israel, ultimately leading to its collapse under international pressure. Now let's stop for a second and think about something. How can you delegitimize a nation you just attacked? It doesn't make any sense. Well, if you think about it like a normal person, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you think like a terrorist, the answer is actually quite simple. Dead babies. But starving children also work. From their point of view, a war that goes on for as long as possible and kills as many civilians as possible is actually the best case scenario. Kidnapping so much civilians is also part of the same strategy. They use them to make sure that Israel fights for as long as they want. Hamas has prepared itself for the war by deliberately integrating themselves in civilian areas so they can use their own population as human shields. Then they started the war, forced families to stay on the front line and prevented their evacuation from the war zone. In this way, they can maximize the number of civilian casualties that they report to the rest of the world. portraying themselves as a helpless victim against the evil Israelis.
قبل ساعتين من الآن بثلاثة صواريخ مصيبة طائرات الاستطلاع الصهيوني، يعني خطوة جريئة قامت بها المواطنون بالتجمهر والاعتلاء سطح هذا المنزل، يعني لمنع طائرات الاحتلال
أن يتعرض الناس وأن يواجهوا الطيران العسكري الإسرائيلي بصدور عارية ليحموا بيوتهم. أعتقد أن هذه سياسة أثبتت نجاعتها، ونحن في الحركة ندعو شعبنا إلى اعتماد هذه السياسة.
Wow, what can I say? Those are some very dedicated civilians. They respect their leaders, they won't say anything bad about them, they are willing to die, to starve. Reminds me of the good people of North Korea. This delegitimization strategy is so successful because it relies on the natural tendency of people to empathize with the victims. And I totally get that. I mean, who doesn't like feeling like they are saving the world and helping the weak? But where do you draw the line exactly? When does somebody stop being a victim and deserve empathy? And assuming you are a victim, does that mean you're allowed to do whatever you want without any consequences?
ما حدا يلومنا، احنا شو اللي بنعمله في 7 اكتوبر، في 10 اكتوبر، في مليون اكتوبر، احنا اللي بنعمله مبرر. It is justified، مبررة.
It's hard to believe that I actually have to say it, but empathizing with mass murderers and rapists does not mean you have the moral high ground. It only shows that you completely lost your common sense when you were chasing it. So, what's it like being a victim of genocide according to Hamas? Instead of participating in peace talks, start a war and label the response as a genocide, even though you can easily stop it at any given time. Exploit the naive and unsuspecting nature of Western countries to delegitimize your enemy. No one's going to believe you're evil enough to let your own population die just to make someone else look bad. Protect terrorists in tunnels and place the civilians on the front lines so they can die instead of you. Claim to be the victim when you intentionally sacrifice the lives of children in Gaza. It's good for your cause, and you have a lot of them anyway. Hamas has essentially forced Israel into a war we cannot win unless the rest of the world understands the kind of opponent we are up against. The same opponent that is flooding their cities and universities with demonstrations. If we don't respond significantly, we normalize mass murder, rape, and kidnapping, and encourage future attacks on our population. If we enter Gaza to fight the terrorists, Hamas hides behind its own civilians to make Israelis look like the bad guys. If Hamas wins, the war goes on for as long as possible, and death is maximized on both sides. The Israeli hostages do not return, and the radical Islamic terrorists stay alive. If Israel wins, the war ends as soon as possible with minimal unnecessary deaths, the hostages return, and the terrorists are wiped out. Which side are you on?